there, this is Debbie Waldeck, and thank you for joining me. This is the Saving Generation Next project, and we're doing part 2, speaking about celiac disease, lactose intolerance, and autoimmune disease. For those that are new, I'm doing an introduction and a review of part 1. The Saving Generation Next project's goal is to teach preventative health education so that we can truly learn the language of the body, allowing us to recognize early red flags and warning signs of impending diagnosis. We may have minor symptoms, PMS, headaches. We wake in the morning and our hands are swollen. But we have not been educated that these are, in fact, red flags and warning signs for future diagnosis. And this will allow us, with knowledge, to take charge of our health. I have started my entire program getting our minds changed and thinking just a little different. That if you're not depressed, or if you are depressed, it doesn't mean you're deficient in Prozac. It is all about thinking, what's going on in my body and what can I do about it? We don't need medications to manage everything if we're living the right lifestyle and have the right information. So let's go ahead and do an introduction and a review of our part 1 before we get started into the celiac and lactose intolerance. The entire premise of my Saving Generation Next project is that those people who have things like allergies, cancer, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, psoriasis, and so on have something in common, and it's not just genetic. It's an inability to optimally digest, absorb, and assimilate our nutrition. It is not just what goes on our plate, but what we absorb. Research shows there's a profound relationship between wellness and absorption. In fact, the gut trains the immune system. Now, in part 1, we defined that the gastrointestinal tract is not just a piece of plumbing, but an active barrier, an active organ involved in immunity. And as that active organ, it acts as a barrier between you and the outside world. We defined that the GI tract is actually outside your body and that every secretion is actually an exocrine secretion like sweat, so saliva, digestive enzymes. And if you swallow an apple and it enters your stomach, it's not yet in your body until it is digested, absorbed, and assimilated and moves into the bloodstream. So the digestive tract then, the intestinal wall is kind of like skin, protecting us. And in that protective barrier is its own outside immune system, as we defined in part 1, and we'll further talk about as we get into autoimmune in the webinar in the part 2. So 60 to 80% of our lymphatic system, according to research, is called gut-associated lymphatic tissue. So I use generally the term 70% because of differences in research. And we know that it's home of healthy microflora. So therefore, 70% of this immune system is called gut-associated lymphatic tissue, and we must address it. Now, to develop this gut-associated lymphatic tissue, we must inoculate the intestinal area with good bacteria. But that's not enough. The probiotics must be developed with prebiotics. Once we do this properly, the gut-associated lymphatic tissue will produce a normal, hyposensitive, not an overreactive immune system. We then addressed in part 1, are we born with this? Are we born with a healthy intestinal area? Are we born with a developed GALT? And we're not. It's developed after birth. And we need this bacteria, and the bacteria in the intestinal area is called intestinal microbial, which just means bacteria in the intestines. And it's massive. It's very active. There's 3 to 5 pounds worth, and the bacteria have many functions. They help to assimilate nutrition, they produce vitamins, and they protect us. These bacteria in and of themselves are little pharmaceutical centers at producing both harmful and helpful substances. So we really want to understand where it comes from. We know that 85% is considered healthy and 15% is considered unhealthy in a normal person. However, because of what I'm going to show you next, we've had a change in that percentage, which is leading to autoimmune disease, asthma, eczema, the hyperactive immune system, and celiac disease, lactose intolerance, and more. So where do we get it from? We defined in part 1 in more detail, I'm just summarizing here today, that when a child is born, they receive their first life or initial inoculation. Prior to that, while the child is in the amniotic sac, it is a sterile environment. Therefore, their intestinal area is sterile. We also define the intestinal wall like soil, and probiotics, or that initial inoculation, as grass seed. So when the child is born, they receive bacteria while moving through the birth canal, but the key is that bacteria in mother's birth canal mirrors what's in her intestinal tract. Therefore, at birth, we receive two inheritances. One is genetic, which is a snapshot of who our parents were at birth, but the second is the microbial inheritance, which is bacteria that represents every experience mother had from the day she was born till the day she birthed you or you birthed your baby. Therefore, if a woman were to prepare herself for childbirth by addressing the health of her intestinal area, thus addressing the health of the bacteria in the birth canal, the child would receive a quality inoculation, or if in essence, quality grass seed. That's why the bacteria in the intestinal area mirrors what's in the birth canal. Now, we've got the soil, which is the intestinal wall. We have the bacteria that the child gets from being born, which is like the grass seed, but we must develop it. And the way we develop it depends on how we're fed, formula feeding or breastfeeding. We discussed that in breast milk, there's three major components. Two of the three have been included in formulas for 80 years, but the last third, this special third called oligosaccharides, which means few sugars, is what's really very, very important for developing the overall immune system. We defined previously that oligosaccharides means few sugars. It acts more like a fiber, hence prebiotics is like fertilizer for the probiotics, and without it you cannot develop an optimal intestinal microbial ecology, that bacteria in the intestinal area. This section will be discussing how the abundance of oligosaccharides produces special antibodies in the gut-associated lymphatic tissue, that barrier that protects us, that helps to temper a hyperactive immune system. We've finished our previous part 1, the gut trains the immune system, showing that because of a decline in the inoculation from generation to generation, because of the increases in drugs and chemicals and so on, because of the lack of knowledge on how to restore the intestinal ecology and thus support the immune system, that today babies who are delivered vaginally and are nursed have an intestinal pH the same as a bottle-fed baby 50 years ago, which is bad, which means we must intervene. Now, when you think about this, the C-section baby, as we discussed before, receives 0 inoculation. They don't get the grass seed. We can develop the little bit that they have, but we see greater incidences of celiac disease in children, for instance, who are born C-section. Now, as we move into the celiac lactose intolerant and autoimmune disease, we're going to go further into the fact that the oligosaccharides create an acidic pH in the intestine. So we're going to learn about pH in the gut and how that triggers enzymes. We know that children who are formula fed, or people who have been on multiple rounds of antibiotics or high sugar diet, or they themselves started with a poor ecology, do not produce a proper pH. When that happens, they're not able to activate the enzymes that digest milk or wheat, and that can lead to lactose intolerance, gluten insensitivities, and celiac. We define, and will continue this discussion, that children who are nursed exclusively for 4 months have reductions in asthma, and for 6 months have reductions in eczema. That means the longer we develop the intestinal ecology and the gut-associated lymphatic tissue, the less hyperactive the immune system is, and the less disease we have. The keynote we finish with is that if you are nursing, the child will have no solid food for 6 months, no formula at all for the first 7 days. And if there is formula that is mixed in with breast milk, it really needs to be supplemented with prebiotics or oligosaccharides. But primarily, the World Health Organization says ideally you should exclusively breastfeed for 6 months. So, the symptoms of intestinal imbalance, the reality is, and I'm not going to go through this because I've done it in part 1, but I want to emphasize that having indigestion, diarrhea, or constipation is not the only sign or symptom of intestinal balance. IBS, Crohn's is not the only sign. The point is that systemic reactions, which are reactions that have nothing to do with the GI tract, to include asthma and acne and eczema and headaches and puffy eyes, hangover feeling upon waking, these are all signs of the intestinal imbalance. And that there's clinical studies that show that numerous diseases are linked to this imbalance. So the question I have is, why aren't every doctor talking about this? Why isn't every doctor talking about this? If a patient comes in with asthma or eczema, the doctor needs to say, we need to work on restoring your intestinal ecology. And that is truly my mission with Saving Generation Next, is to spread this word so it becomes part of your protocol. Whether you have breast cancer, colon cancer, fibromyalgia, we're going to work to restore intestinal imbalance. So what we're going to do as we go through part 2 is to do something you might think is dry and boring, but we really want to understand the role of the GI tract. It's, again, not just a piece of plumbing. Yes, it breaks down proteins with digestive enzymes and pH, and the intestinal area is where most of the absorption occurs, but there's also a significant immune system that is involved and activated and affected by what we eat and how we respond in our environment. So I hope you join me as we further our discussion in part 2 of the Foundation of Health and Saving Generation Next project, as we explore more in-depth celiac disease, lactose intolerance, and autoimmune disease. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next webinar.